Hello and welcome everybody to our spring edition of the Global 60s Colloquium. We're very, very happy to welcome you here for a wonderful talk by Matt Swagler on Senegal and the Congo. And it is my utmost pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today, who is a dear friend and colleague, Pedro Monaville, who is an associate professor of history at McGill University. And Pedro is going to moderate through the event. Today, we follow the usual format, means that Matt is going to give us a talk, a lecture for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, through the chat and the Q&A box on Zoom, and then we're going to entertain his answers for as long as we have time. So take it away, Pedro. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks, Nisha, also for the invitation to moderate this session of the colloquium. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to introduce Matthew, who's the speaker for today. Matthew Swagler is assistant professor of history at Connecticut College. His work focuses on 20th century African history, particularly the social and political ruptures that took place in Senegal and Congo-Brazzaville in the wake of formal independence from French colonial rule. Dr. Swagler has published articles on the Congolese Revolution of 1963, the influence of youth and student movements on Cold War politics in Central Africa, and the historical relationship between Pan-Africanism and African Marxism. He's currently completing a book manuscript entitled Decolonization's Discontents, Youth Radicalism and the Struggle over Independence in Senegal and Congo, 1958-1974. And Matt's talk today is entitled Generative Repression, Radical Organizing and the State in Senegal and Congo after Independence. So the floor is yours, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much to the editors of the Global 60s Journal, to Martin Klimke and to Nisha Zachariah for organizing the colloquium series. And thank you, Pedro, for moderating and commenting on my presentation. And of course, to everyone who came out today. So I guess the usual caveat, which is that this is very much a work in progress. I'm seeing this as a chance to present my research, but also to put forth some ideas about a more general historical question in the study of the global 60s, and that is, how do we think about repression? Because I think for any of us who work on social movements in the kind of context of the global 60s, or even sort of politics more generally, social life, social history, certainly repression kind of looms large in a lot of the kind of source materials, the interviews, other materials that we're working with day to day. So I think the place I'm coming from in thinking about this talk, and I'll share my slide, I guess, and I might as well get that started now. Let me do that first. Great. So in narratives of the global 60s, repression often marks the endpoint of episodes of intense radical organizing and/or mass protest. So much was possible until suddenly, in the face of state or imperial violence, it wasn't. Whether we think of COINTELPRO's infiltration of the Black Panthers, or Soviet tanks rolling into Prague, or the massacre of Mexican students in Tlatelolco 10 days before the opening of the '68 Summer Olympics, these and so many other moments of violence famously signal the end, at least for a time, of major chapters of mass upheaval. Even in those movements where participants have sought to engage in physical combat with the forces of order, at the end of the day, the state and its monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, so to speak, tended to prevail. So in 1968, of course, students threw cobblestones at French gendarmes. Pakistani students launched stones and bricks at the Western hotels where their ministers hid. And Japanese students fought the police with bamboo gewalt sticks. But government appeals to restore order and delegitimize oppositional forms of violence predominantly succeeded. So in Congo and Senegal, where I conduct my research, we also have these moments of repression that seem to mark down the closing of possibilities of the 1960s. In Senegal, you have the case of Omar Blondin Diop, a young Marxist who had participated in the 68 student uprisings in Paris and returned to Senegal to engage in left-wing opposition organizing, particularly trying to start anarchist movements. He was later murdered in prison in Senegal in 1973. Thousands of his young comrades took to the streets in the aftermath of his death, but the student movement in Senegal did not really recover for another decade. Meanwhile, in Congo-Brazzaville, the other place where I do my work, just a month before Diop's killing in Senegal, a group of young Marxists were executed for attempting to organize a popular uprising against the military government there. Such high-profile killings of both countries were accompanied by the banning, imprisoning, and conscription into the military of wider swaths of student activists, trade unionists, and even young military officers in the early 1970s. But if repression brings a sense of finality to so many of our histories of the global 60s, why then were social movements not always crushed by earlier episodes of repression? That the forces of the state only seem to succeed at the end of many of our narratives of the global 60s presumes that there is a before time when repression was either not present or not truly being applied. But in my research on Senegal and Congo in the 1960s, it's become clear that repression against left-wing opposition movements had been both violent and continual from the end of the colonial period in the 50s throughout the 1960s. But such repression did not completely destroy movements. To the contrary, it often became the impetus for opposition to explode in size and intensity. So in Congo, when police tried to shut down a labor union demonstration in 1963, it led to mass protests that brought down the country's first independent government. 5 years later, Senegalese security forces invaded the University of Dakar to stop a student strike, only to have the action backfire, setting off an urban rebellion and a general strike, the aftermath of which I'll come back to, but you can see it on the first slide. So I want to, in this presentation, explore these moments of repression that failed in Senegal and Congo, moments when repression was instead generative. And the term generative has its origins, of course, in biology, meaning having the power or function of generating, originating, producing, or reproducing. Repression, of course, can play a role in producing or reproducing state power, but I use the idea of generative repression differently, when instead of reproducing state power, repression produced or reproduced movements that undermine the state. Sorry, there we go. In Congo and Senegal, generative repression took place on two levels in the 1960s. First, when attempts to shut down actions or target activists instead produced new forms of mass struggle that dwarfed the initially limited target of the original repression. As mentioned earlier, this is what took place in Congo in 1963 and in Senegal in 68. When government attempts to quash protests before they got out of hand, ironically, became the reason they got out of hand. Second, I also use generative repression. Sorry, that's the first one on the slide. Here's the second one. I also use this idea of generative repression to refer to the feelings of commitment and comradeship that were produced by specific experiences of repression and that foster later struggles. In Congo and Senegal, repression frequently disrupted organizations in the late 1950s and 60s, but it also steeled individuals, deepening their sense of commitment to sacrifice and to a notion of revolution. Now, the second definition of generative repression builds on Menajeh Moradian's study of Iranian student activists. And Moradian advances a cluster of useful concepts for scholars of the global 60s. One that really resonates with my idea of generative repression is her notion of revolutionary affect, which she describes in the book as visceral intensities generated by experiences of repression and resistance that remain latent in the body. She later writes, revolutionary affect encompasses the power of being impacted by the world such that one is out of sync with the dominant order, and the power to sustain revolutionary activity designed to change that same order. Moradian argues that the repression faced by students, their families, and their comrades under the Shah produced a way of being in the world that led them toward rather than away from revolutionary politics. As I argue in this talk, such experiences also became common in Congo, and even more so in Senegal throughout the 1960s. So the point here overall, as obvious as it may be, is that repression was only sometimes an endpoint for struggles against the state. At other times, it was a starting place for both individuals and the movements they created. So I'll now kind of transition. I'm going to talk about Congo and Senegal, the two places that I focus on in my book manuscript. And obviously, in an effort to kind of focus more on this conception of generative repression, the following sections will not do justice to the complexity of political life in either Senegal or Congo-Brazzaville in the 60s, but I'm happy to expound on any of the history and nuances of it later in our discussion. So I'll turn first to Congo. Both Congo and Senegal become independent from France between 58 and 1960. The African-led governments elected in each new nation, although very different, both foresaw an independence that maintained close connections to the former metropole. France was, in their eyes, a resource and a guarantee of stability, not a neo-colonial force. In the years immediately preceding and following the raising of the new Congolese flag, a defrocked Catholic priest, Fulbert Youlou, who you can see here, he insisted on still wearing his priestly kaftan, even after the church, had kicked him out. He kind of arose to power as the first president, often through the violent mobilization of his followers. And during this time, he focused on eliminating competition from rival electoral parties. So he used a cycle that many scholars of the global 60s are probably familiar with, a cycle of repression and rehabilitation that successfully wore down most of his parliamentary opponents. So heads of rival political parties were frequently arrested, then pardoned, and then offered a position within the administration. And Youlou's strategy seemingly worked. A few months after independence, he forced a new constitution through the National Assembly that provided for a more centralized presidential model of governance. Then, in early 1963, his former parliamentary rivals agreed to Youlou's proposal for the creation of a single-party state. Now, although Youlou and his main parliamentary rivals had been locked in fierce competition, their ideological differences were largely indiscernible. So long as his rivals were invited into the new ruling party state, they agreed to support Youlou's leadership. However, the capital city of Brazzaville was also home to a cluster of small trade unions, student, and youth organizations that formed in the late 50s and early 1960s that were very unhappy with what they saw as incomplete independence under Youlou. Youlou's administration moved very quickly to marginalize each of these groups by attacking their left-wing politics, as many had roots in the French Communist Party or the French left more generally, and sometimes Third World networks. However, most members' adherence to Marxism was tenuous at best. In the interviews I conducted with former activists, very few members of these sort of left-wing organizations outside of electoral politics considered themselves communists or even Marxists in the early 60s. At first, most were much more interested in the Soviet Union or China, for example, because they saw them as offering different models of national development. But for Youlou, who had risen in Congolese politics with the help of Vichy-era French business owners, even tentative associations to the French or international left was evidence of a possible threat. Youlou first turned on students abroad, banning them from voting in Congolese elections and suspending the scholarships of the most outspoken students. But he was far more worried about youth and labor unions that were within the capital city of Brazzaville. Brazzaville was home to the country's greatest concentration of waged unionized workers. And moreover, the city had at least doubled in population just in the 3 years following independence, almost entirely due to the arrival of young people in their teens and 20s from the countryside seeking jobs and schooling. Local chapters of the Congolese Youth Union grew rapidly as they began to voice criticisms of Youlou. Aimé Matsika, who was both a trade union and union leader, openly criticized the incoming regime and agitated, along with his comrades, for real independence of the Congo, which included not only formal independence, but also Congo's dominance by foreign capital and the need for the Africanization of private and public institutions. Moreover, many young students saw themselves naturally aligned with the nationalist aspirations of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba across the river in the former Belgian Congo. When he was arrested in December 1960, there was a movement of Congolese students to desert the Lycée Savognin de Brazza, Brazzaville's only public high school for boys. Much to the chagrin of young students, Yulu was an active ally, I should say, of Moise Tshombe, the Katanga secessionist leader who was, of course, complicit in Lumumba's murder. As you can see here, Yulu and Tshombe were very close both before and after Lumumba's murder. And this picture on the right is actually from a youth publication that came out after the fall of Yulu, when Tshombe becomes prime minister briefly in the DRC. And it pictures him holding American dollars, portrayed as the devil threatening the revolution in Congo-Brazzaville. So during this time in the early 60s, a growing number of youth and student activists begin to see themselves, if not necessarily as Marxists, then certainly as anti-imperialists and anti-Yulu. And they begin to take up this call that M.A. Matsika had raised around this idea of real independence or true independence. So in May of 1960, just a few months before Congo becomes formally independent, 7 youth activists, including Matsika, are arrested, supposedly in their role in a communist plot against the government. Yulu's administration, however, presented no evidence of what the plot was or whether it had ever existed. Shortly thereafter, the government also banned the Congolese Youth Union. Just 2 days after those arrests, the National Assembly passes a series of laws requiring that all public meetings have to be declared to the government ahead of time. They banned protests against the government and any publication that was even calling for such protests. When students in Brazzaville's local high schools tried to create a student organization in 1961, the government simply refused to grant them legal status. When they nevertheless organized a strike that year in protest of poor treatment and physical abuse by their European teachers, the government responded to the strike by sending in police to arrest the students, beating many in the process. Yet despite this repression, the French embassy in Congo reported that the illegal Congolese Youth Union still could count among its ranks about 800 members or sympathizers, including unionized workers. Comparing different police surveillance records from the time, from what I can tell, this means that actually the Congolese Youth Union grew after it was deemed illegal under Yulu's government. As the president and his ministers became known for cavorting with mistresses in luxury cars in the African popular neighborhood of Bakongo, new migrants felt the sting of unemployment and overcrowded schools. Yulu's repression did not chase everyone away from the youth organizations. Rather, as his popularity and legitimacy began to decline in the eyes of the Brazzaville public, the youth and union opposition became legitimized at the same time that it was being repressed. So by the summer of 1963, Yulu is proposing his party state. And when left-wing trade unionists protested, he promptly had them arrested. This, however, backfired. The much more politically conservative Catholic trade unions, who had always kind of kept the left-wing unions at arm's length, suddenly came to their defense. The Catholics shared in opposition to being absorbed by a new party state. So together, the unions now called for a joint demonstration on August 13th, just 2 days before the single-party state was supposed to be created. But Yulu declared the demonstration illegal, and none of Congo's radio or newspapers would dare to announce it. The night before the proposed demonstration, gendarmes began their arrests of union leaders. The next morning, even as 7,000 people began to gather in front of the Bourse de Travail, gendarmes pulled union leaders out of their cars and off of buses as they tried to make their way across town to get to the building. But it was at this moment, on the morning of August 13th, that something changed. People began to instead turn on the gendarmes, who were led that day by the French colonel Alfred Jean, and began to harass them. They were met with charges of mounted police and tear gas, just as demonstrators began to learn about the arrest from the night before. Thousands of people decided to march to the Maison d'Arrêt, which was basically Brazzaville's municipal prison, where they suspected that all of the arrested unionists were being held. Upon arrival, the demonstrators found themselves immediately facing more police and military, who after a brief hesitation opened fire with live ammunition, killing 3 of the young protesters. This, however, only further inflamed the situation, and the demonstrators, angered and undeterred, took control of the prison at 10:30 in the morning, released all 355 prisoners held inside, including many of the Union comrades. Word of the 3 young demonstrators who had been killed quickly spread across the city, even as French and Congolese troops tried to take back control. Yulu, it seemed, had gone too far. Even in his own strongholds in the neighborhood of Bakongo, for example, or among the gendarmerie, or among his party's women's organizations, members of his own party began to call for the removal of his government and to sack government offices, as you can see from these photos taken right afterwards. 2 days later, a massive demonstration surrounded the presidential palace, but this time even the police and military began to hesitate, eventually leading Yulu and his very, I guess you could say, bloated government of 20 ministers to resign. It was the first popular movement in sub-Saharan Africa to overthrow a government, and it took place exactly 3 years to the day that Congo-Brazzaville had become an independent country. The 3 days, which become popularly known as Les Trois Glorieuses, were followed by the formation of a new government and the start of what the new president, Alphonse Massamba Deba, heralded as the Congolese Revolution. In this situation, the stage was set for the rise of precisely those activists who had borne the brunt of Yulu's repression. Student activists from Brazzaville and from abroad, some still in their early 20s, took advantage of the new political environment, and many, like Aimé Nali, Martin Mberi, and others, were elected to the new National Assembly, or given positions within the government administration. Once in the National Assembly, the young activists who had been previously banned and jailed now began passing laws. They nationalized the country's French-owned utility companies, they Africanized Congo's missionary schooling system, they expelled the French military, and began to open up relationships with communist and Marxist regimes. This is the next year, where you already have Mao Zedong and the new president of Congo, Alphonse Massamba Deba, meeting to open up relationships between the two countries. Yulu, on the other hand, he eventually escaped house arrest and he settles in Spain. He saw his worst fears realized as the Congolese Revolution opened up political horizons for the exact same people that he had tried to arrest, beat, and ban during the early years of Congo's independence. However, most of the people who took to the streets in 1963, who broke open the prison or who surrounded the presidential palace, were not members of these illegal student, youth, and trade union organizations. Rather, Yulu's calls for a single-party state, his arrest of the trade unionists, and finally the shooting of the 3 young men outside of the prison created both of the forms of generative repression that I started with. First, Les Trois Glorieuses was an example of generative repression in the most obvious sense. You have an accumulation of urban residents' material grievances mounting over the previous 3 years, and their hesitation in supporting Yulu's party state. There was no reason that had to boil over. But the state violence on display in August of '63 produces a kind of resistance to that, or a kind of awakening of those grievances, and a resistance to the state that otherwise may not have come to pass. Second, Yulu's banning and repeated arrests of his radical critics, particularly the youth organization leaders in Brazzaville, produced a more coherent sense of political identity and purpose. As Yulu became more rigidly repressive and rigidly anti-communist, those on the receiving end of arrests and bannings didn't soften their critiques. Instead, they became more convinced of the righteousness of their opposition and more driven towards Marxism. Their behavior is a perfect example of the kind of revolutionary affect described by Muradian in her work on Iranian students. Experiences of repression became part of how they presented themselves in the world, something that became even more clear to me over the course of my interviews. So finally, I want to turn to Senegal and kind of wrap up on this. And I'm going to focus on, pretty much the same time period. But just sort of, we're going to shift gears to another former French colony. As French colonial rule began to transform in the late 50s, electoral power in Senegal moved firmly into the hands of the famous poet Léopold Sédar Senghor. You can see here in front of what appears to be Lyndon Baines Johnson. Senghor would go on to serve as president for the first 20 years of Senegal's independent existence. As occurred simultaneously in Congo-Brazzaville, the new Senegalese government used a process of repression and rehabilitation. So electoral opponents were often first thrown into jail in order to make them more tractable, then brought into Senghor's ruling party. Senghor conceived of his party as a parti unifié rather than a parti unique, so a unified party rather than a single party. But by the mid-1960s, with all parliamentary opposition banned and his former prime minister imprisoned, Senegal effectively became a single-party state under Senghor's leadership. But shockingly, in 1968, as I mentioned before, a student strike that was called for by only a group of about 20 students at the beginning spilled into an urban uprising and a general strike that nearly toppled Senghor and forced him to adopt strikers' demands for reform. It was the deepest crisis of popular opposition Senghor would ever face. As in Congo during the late 50s and early 60s, while Senghor was securing his authority, there was also a cluster of organizations, political parties, trade unionists, student organizations, that attempted to maintain a critical autonomy from his parti unifié. Like their counterparts in Brazzaville, they disputed the negotiated terms of independence with France, calling in much this very similar language to what was happening in Congo-Brazzaville. They would call for things like indépendance totale or total independence, or indépendance véritable, a kind of true or genuine independence. They protested many of the same dynamics in Senegal, the ongoing presence of French troops in Senegal, the control of the education system by French admins and faculty, and the foreign domination of the national economy. One of the important organizations at the heart of the calls for real independence was the Parti africain de l'indépendance, or the African Independence Party, and I'll refer to it by its acronyms here, the PAI. It was founded by Majmout Diop, who's featured in the center of this slide, with W.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois on his right, and on his left, Zhu Yang and Mao Dun at the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference in Tashkent in 1958. The PAI and Majmout Diop kind of come out of these multiracial communist study groups that were led by French Communist Party activists in the 1950s in Dakar, but also in other cities, including in Brazzaville. Brazzaville also had their own, what were they called, the Groupe d'études communistes, and in other African cities under French control like Abidjan. However, Majmout Diop initially insisted on, when he created the PAI, the party being a socialist, but not necessarily a Marxist organization. Still, the links to the Communist Party and to sort of the kind of global left were hardly a secret. When Amady Ali Dieng, who was a young student, comes to the University of Dakar and he finds the PAI, when I was interviewing him, he talked about how he and his comrades were immediately kind of thrown into these study groups of 20 different titles, including certainly works by Marx and Lenin, but also by a lot of Soviet writers, offering their sort of glosses on questions around imperialism and national development. So the PAI and its associated student and trade union allies, although small, were accused by Senghor's government of working on behalf of, as he said, he would use the term foreigners. Colonial officials considered it, in their words, a vanguardist party, quote, impregnated with Marxism-Leninism. The PAI's influence far exceeded its small size. So its papers, particularly La Lutte, which kind of circulated around sort of Francophone spaces, but also Moom Sa Réew, which in Wolof kind of means like own or possess your country. You can think of it as sort of self-determination. That was more of a Senegalese kind of publication. But La Lutte in particular had a circulation of about 5,000 copies by kind of mid-1958, 1959. And so they had still a fairly sizable audience. During the transition to formal independence, Senegalese political authorities and French police used a combination of colonial laws and new ordinances to repeatedly ban or try to shut down PAI meetings and to limit its influence. Such measures were soon expanded to include worker strikes and independent student organizing at the University of Dakar. So the PAI's attempts to hold meetings and distribute literature that was critical of Senghor and his regime become the focus of this repression. In 1959, Senegalese authorities banned speeches, writings, posters, and personal statements that might, quote, disturb public order or offend or insult public officials, unquote. Over the next few years, PAI members, including Majmout Diop, were arrested nearly 100 times, often repeatedly, some held in prison without charge for up to 10 months. The organization was hit with tens of thousands of dollars of fines, which they could not pay, and they were permanently banned in 1960, while Majmout Diop fled the country. Around the same time, the government fired 3,000 striking public sector workers and transferred left-wing teachers from urban schools out to remote locations in eastern Senegal. The Students' First Congress at the University of Dakar, which had only really come together in 1957 as a university, drew nearly 1,000 attendees. Students used the platform to decry Senghor's alliances with France. They read statements from the PAI prisoners who were on hunger strike, and they condemned France's violence in Algeria and nuclear testing in the Sahara. Over the next year, Senghor responded by sweeping in with police to shut down student meetings, carrying out a wave of arrests, and expelling non-Senegalese students, and finally banning the existence of independent student organizations in 1963. So on the one hand, the intensity of the attacks on the PAI and independent student unions disrupted their ability to openly contest Senghor's increasingly centralized control of the state. On the other hand, the PAI and its student wing took on a certain mythical, almost martyr-like quality for the next generation of incoming students and young union members. In the context where there was no legal parliamentary opposition to Senghor and his party after 1963, the PAI's history of opposition to Senghor since the 1950s provided a certain kind of revolutionary credibility or cachet for many young people. And this brings me back again to kind of Muradian's concept of revolutionary affect. The experience of repeated repression convinced members that the party must be on the right side of a global struggle. So when I spoke to a lot of former PAI activists, they echoed something that Majmout Diop argued back in the early 60s. He said, the best title of nobility for the PAI is it not the blind fury and morbid hatred that the colonialists and their Senegalese agents feel for us? And Moussa Khan, who was a student activist with the PAI in the late 60s, and also vice president of the illegal student union during the strike in 68, he presents an interesting example of a young person who was kind of drawn to this kind of this idea of the kind of revolutionary affect that the PAI sort of put out in the world. This is a picture I took of Moussa. He's in the center there in the white kaftan, and this is a picture I took outside of the kind of old office of the PAI in Pekin, outside of Dakar, back in 2012. So he joined the PAI because of the kind of memory he had of the organization when he was in middle school in Saint Louis in the late 50s. At the time, he had a French teacher, Tidjane Baidi Ly, who was in the PAI. He had seen Lee and other teachers being interrogated by the police and arrested at school. Moussa Khan recounted that his teachers did not talk to the students about what was happening, but that the students eventually kind of came to understand. When Patrice Lumumba was killed, Moussa Khan and his classmates began to protest. They walked out of classes, and the first group that they ran out to on the streets of Saint Louis was, of course, the PAI, with tracts about the assassination and attacking, and also tracts that were attacking the complicity of figures like Senghor. So years later, like 6 years later, he comes to the University of Dakar, and the first thing that he does is to seek out the student section of the PAI. By the time the student strike happens at the University of Dakar in 1968, 4 out of 7 of the elected officers of the illegal student union that called for a strike are either PAI, student PAI members or former members, including Mokhtar Diak, who was the person who wrote basically all of the student pamphlets. Interestingly, because the student PAI and the PAI in general was an underground clandestine organization, members often didn't know who their comrades were. So Mokhtar Jaq, who was one of the PAI members in '68, recounted to me that he didn't realize that the president of the student union, Mbai Jaq, with whom he worked closely like every day, had also been a member of the PAI as well. So this kind of sets the stage for this strike in 1968, and I'll finish by talking about what that strike sort of gives us in terms of this idea of generative repression. During the 5 years prior, the university, before 68, the 5 years before 68, the university became increasingly overcrowded. Students lost much of their financial support, workers' wages stagnated while the cost of living skyrocketed, urban unemployment jumped, and farmers faced a drought alongside a major drop in peanut prices. There were plenty of reasons for frustrations to boil over, but much like in Congo in 1963, I argue that it took some sort of trigger for that to happen, and that specifically the use of violence by the state was that trigger that led to the mass uprising of '68 that nearly topples the government. So things really get set in motion when the government proposes cutting student living stipends, and the student unions vote to call a strike of classes. And here's, I think, the only picture that we have of students actually during the strike, sitting outside the faculté de droit, the law school faculty, on the steps instead of going to their classes. Now, Senghor assumed the students would be ignored by the larger public. They had struck before, he had been able to quash it, and he didn't think it was going to be a big deal. He bashed them in speeches for being greedy, out of touch, disruptive, and perhaps most interestingly, he attacked them for not being good Marxists. But after 2 days of the strike, a newly created unit of riot police cut off all movement in and out of the campus and then struck with tear gas grenades. As students attempted to take cover in their dorms, riot police stormed the campus, leaving students skin charred, many unconscious, and at least one thrown out of the top story of a dormitory. Those who fled were beaten with rifle butts before being taken to police vans. At least one student perished, and nearly 500 were taken to a military camp in the north of Senegal. The following day, the government began to deport a total of over 1,300 non-Senegalese nationals, mostly other West Africans who had come to Dakar for schooling. By all accounts, in the immediate aftermath, this raid was a success. Student opposition was violently broken. But the attack on campus was interpreted or read very differently by most of Dakar's urban residents. Senghor would later lament to his inner circle that his support in Dakar seemed to melt away following the siege of the campus. Instead, what Senghor had most feared 8 years earlier began to actually happen. The arrest of the student activists catalyzed a rebellion that threatened the existence of his regime. Almost immediately, secondary school students walked out of their classes, causing the government to close schools nationwide. But this just freed up students to begin fighting with police outside of their schools. Street fighting soon spread to working class neighborhoods in Dakar, where unemployed men and school leavers did not hesitate to set fire to police stations. They set fire to the brand new ruling party headquarters, and they attacked the home of a particularly hostile national radio announcer. I don't have records of what that announcer was saying, but they clearly hated him because they attacked his house twice in 2 days. The state-sponsored Trade Union Federation, on the other hand, which had initially ignored the student strike, soon faced rank-and-file pressure to demand that the arrested and expelled students be released. Most of these students, after all, lived with extended family, including a lot of union workers, in the city. This allowed some of the more radical unionists and some of the former PAI activists in the unions to begin to call for a general strike, both in kind of solidarity with the students, but also to raise demands about democracy and about stagnating worker living conditions. So suddenly, the urban uprising also turns into a strike. Union leaders and thousands of Dakar residents gathered on May 1st, June 1st, this would have been like sort of end of May, early June, in front of the Bourse de Travail on the morning of the general strike. And police launched tear gas canisters into the crowd and arrest the union leaders, 31 men and 5 women. So we have an almost kind of an exact replay of 1963 in Brazzaville. With the city shut down by the strike, battles raged in the streets of Dakar's most crowded neighborhoods all day long. By the time a combination of Senegalese and French troops finally took control of the city again 2 days later, more than 1,000 people had been arrested. Senghor seemingly had yet again won. The military had stayed true to him, and his alliance with the French armed forces proved crucial as his government teetered on the edge of collapse. And yet the siege of the University of Dakar had ultimately backfired. Over the next few months and years, he was forced to do what he had refused to do prior, which was to negotiate with independent student and worker unions. The university was reformed to move towards greater Senegalese control, and in a few years, Senghor would concede to multi-party elections, albeit limited, but still, for the first time since independence, this crack in the kind of monopoly on power was beginning to break. And here's actually the cover of Dakar Matin, I think it was, the morning when he announces first his concessions to the strikers for an increase in minimum wage, price controls, and the kind of Senegalization or Africanization of industries. So to draw it all together, I know I'm coming up, I'm at the end of my time, so I'm just going to wrap up here, and say that, we have these two kind of examples of Congo and Senegal that I'm trying to work with in my manuscript. And, what I was noticing as I was doing is just how these patterns fall into kind of similar grooves, right? Where both post-colonial regimes sought to assimilate their electoral rivals into a unified single-party state under strong presidential leadership. But Yulu and Senghor both kind of delineated these certain left-wing activists who they deemed unassimilable. For them, repression was meant to silence and scatter, not to co-opt them. And this two-pronged strategy seemed to work. Repression, had seemed to have kind of produced state power, sometimes for many years, as in the case of Senegal. But what I argue is that basically time was not on Yulu or Senghor's side. As their popularity began to dip, particularly in the capital cities, acts of violent repression by the regime end up generating empathy for the victims rather than enforcing enmity towards these left-wing organizations. This was particularly true, again, in these capital cities where the median age of the population was under 25, and so too were most of the victims of repression. And this creates this generative repression in the most explosive way, the massive urban uprisings I talked about in Congo and Senegal. But like I said at the beginning, generative repression also operated on this other level, right? Where it generates this deeper sense of comradeship and radicalization among the young activists who were arrested, banned, and even tortured. Organizations were temporarily destroyed, but rather than eviscerating the individual's political commitments, for some, repression fortified those commitments. And this was something that became clear as I interviewed former activists about their political journeys and political trajectories. Although something to be discussed, I think, is how men really latched onto this kind of narrative of revolutionary affect, much more so than the women who I spoke to. And I will just say, as a last sentence here, that separating memory and history is very difficult. So my conceptualization of generative repression is not meant to downplay or romanticize resistance to state repression in the global 60s, which some of my interviewees even kind of tended to do. But I still think that such memories are rooted in a sense of pride that was present at the time and gives us some space to kind of open up and think about repression and the ways that it could have been in a kind of counterintuitive way, very generative. So thanks everyone for your time. Apologies for going long, and I look forward to your comments and questions. And I will stop sharing. Hold on one second. Sorry, I'm not seeing the stop share option. I'm not sure if that's a webinar format question. I don't know why, but for some reason, and I don't know if anyone else is able to end the share, but I seem to not be seeing it. So
yeah, I don't think I have much control here on the webinar.
Okay, I got it now. Thanks. Okay. I think I should be able to do it. No, it's still not letting me.
Okay.
Did it work?
Yeah, it worked.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a great project. I was really happy to yeah, hear your, I guess, more recent thoughts and this idea of generative repression, which I I guess is going to be the object of the main object of the discussion today and the questions. I have some questions on that and how, kind of maybe to play with that this idea a little bit. But I guess so I'm before we open up to the Q&A, I have just a few remarks or more questions to start us. And the first one, maybe, yeah, before going to this idea of generative repression, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your approach in the broader project to working with transnationally with Senegal and Congo-Brazzaville and maybe like how that's also it's structuring also your manuscript I and yeah I'm curious in a little bit about, yes, like if you could speak a little bit about why you decided to work with these two countries, and if at points in the research um, there are connections that emerge. I guess because the most of the presentation today is like comparative, I would say. So looking at the two cases to see how um, this notion, kind of is generative and is an interesting notion to understand what's happening in both cases. But is there a part of your, conceptual constructions and then also understanding of the historiographical dynamics of the 60s in Africa, also like emerging from maybe connections and circulations and how are maybe like where the historical actors also thinking about uh, this pairing of Senegal and Congo's political histories, which are obviously there's like so many good reasons to bring these two cases together, and I think it's actually very productive, but also significant differences in their trajectories and histories. So it's kind of maybe too broad of a question and query, and you can answer that in any way that you want. And I'll just add like maybe like a couple of other questions more closely related to the idea of generative repression, which is a concept or a notion, a framing that clearly resonates a lot with the context of Congo-Kinshasa, which is the one that I'm most immediately familiar with, and where I kind of sort of like so like it's inviting me to rethink about my own work, I think in insightful ways for myself. So thanks for that. But I really liked something that you said at the beginning of the presentation about kind of your attempt at challenging the idea of a before repression or before violence, uh, which instead you're trying to outline a continuity in repression, state repression, state violence of student worker movements in both cases, and I can also see we can see that in I guess in many contexts, and so it's an interesting relevant idea. At the same time, what I also see like in the context of Congo-Kinshasa, for instance, is um, in the history that I was looking at, but a clear moment of rupture, in terms of political violence and in terms of the perception of political violence, in terms of the perception of the morality or immorality of the state, in terms of its use of violence. And so in my research, it was there were different moments, but one important moment is a student massacre in 1969 when there's these the army is opening fire on students and killing many students, and that's seen as, clearly a moment of rupture, when a form of violence that was very typical of the colonial state, that had been applied before in, repression of uh, rural rebellions like the Mulele uprisings and the Simba uprisings, but is happening in the space of the city in Kinshasa against the educated elite of the nation, and that's seen as kind of a moment of rupture. And that rupture as a form of transgression is also produced, generative in its own way of a new type of state apparatus, a new relationship between state and society as well, and which becomes the Mobutu regime, and with the so-called return to authenticity in the context of Congo Zaire. So there is a rupture, and there is a generative dimension here, but it's generating a new form of of state construction and state violence, and also a new project of decolonization, but a project of decolonization that is authoritarian and in many ways conservative. So I was wondering if you see some of the kind of also similar maybe dynamics in the cases of Senegal and Brazzaville, to some, in a way that I might not be able to, fully flesh out now, but this also kind of brought to mind the recent work of Samuel Ferry, Charles Daly on militarization, and, as another type of, you know, production or, generative aspects that's happening in the context of repression in the early post-colonial years. And so I have like several other questions, but I'm going to just ask one other question now, so not to put too many things on the on the table at first. But thinking about repression, I was wondering if you want to think, if you'd be interested in thinking about maybe a typology here of different, what would be what would be a typology for state repression, and also in thinking about the generative, dimension of, political ideas, political organizations, and activism, etc. I'm thinking about, the experience of exile as a form of repression, the experience of imprisonment, which was very, powerful, I guess, and occupied a lot of space in the conversations that I had with student activists in Congo Kinshasa, as the present, as, generating a new form of kind of being like an important momentum sometimes in activist trajectories, which, so I was thinking if this is something that is reflected also on your work. In the case that I worked, on which I worked, there was also the forced enrollment into the military, which was also a really interesting moment of, kind of development in the political trajectories of activists. And yes, what would be kind of a useful typology, I guess, for Senegal and Congo-Brazzaville, if this is something that you're interested to think about.
Thank you. Thanks for those great comments and questions. And my apologies to you, Pedro. You only got like the first third of the talk beforehand, so I realize you're having to kind of respond on the fly to a lot of this. Yeah, well, first of all, just thanks. I mean, I'm really glad that you're joining us today for this, because I was certainly thinking a lot about your book and the kind of travails of the Congolese student movement on the other side of the river, sometimes really just right across the river from what was happening in Brazzaville. So I guess so there's a lot of, I think you're raising a lot of really interesting points. I mean, one of the things, to go back to your original question about kind of why Senegal and Congo together, I mean, I guess certainly when you've got two historical case studies, there's going to be something comparative there. But what I'm kind of what I'm more interested is in kind of parallels and overlaps. And this is where the transnational becomes very useful, because a lot of these kind of, sort of more left-wing clandestine organizations, they are getting their literature, a lot of their sort of training, some of their resources from some of the same kind of communist world or sort of French left or kind of third world networks. And often, the students who are studying abroad in France are kind of a resource. They're sort of outside of the immediate reach. I mean, they're always threatened with losing their scholarships, but they're kind of outside the immediate reach of the state repression that people are experiencing, quote, at home, quote unquote, right? And so that's always important. So there's all these ways that, with the PAI, for example, there are PAI members in Congo-Brazzaville as well, even though it's a much more kind of Senegalese-based organization and party. And so there's all these ways that they're, what I'm interested in is how these different kind of left-wing or sort of oppositional formations are kind of interacting with these global networks in such a way that it's not the case that, like, the activists from Congo and Senegal really knew each other particularly well. It's not that literal. But there's all these ways in which they kind of inhabit this very similar world. And of course, Brazzaville and Dakar are the two, had been the two capitals of, French West Africa and French Central Africa, those two colonial federations respectively. And so they're these major centers of kind of political power, but also of education. And, I think one of the things you mentioned and one of the things that you really talk about in your book in terms of students is these new states, and even the kind of end of the colonial state, right, is really trying to kind of promote its educational work. And there's a lot of kind of expectation sort of riding on young intellectuals as sort of nation builders. And what happens when they kind of refuse to build the nation in the way that the elders want them to build the nation? What kind of processes of negotiation or if that doesn't work, of repression, are then kind of put into place. But I think that creates a problem for both of these regimes in very similar ways, right? In that on the one hand, they're sort of touting the importance of these institutions of education, while at the same time, they're sort of saying that the people that are going through them are actually a problem. And so I think this is where you get this kind of dynamic where Senghor is, Senghor didn't need to respond specifically to the student tracks, but in 1968, he's like responding point by point to their claims. He's quoting Mao back to them when they're quoting Mao to him. He's engaging with them at that level because they had, like you said, a certain kind of level of, kind of social and intellectual cachet. And so I think that, both of those countries kind of share this very similar sort of milieu, and they're interacting in these transnational spaces in a very similar way. The other thing that I think is behind my interest in repression is just that it's so omnipresent through this whole period. What's really interesting is just how striking, this period of the late 50s into the early 60s is, where you still have all these like French gendarmerie, you have these French police commanders, you've got this combination of like French colonial era, like repressive laws being applied, and new like ones being created by these new African governments. And so you really have this like very kind of it's not clean, but it's almost like sort of shocking continuity, right? Of like modes of colonial repression being applied to these organizations before independence even happens, right? And so, Senghor is already sort of using the colonial apparatus to clear house in Senegal before the new Senegalese flag goes up. And so it's interesting to me there too to kind of think about this repression as this just kind of ongoing, right, kind of experience. Like, yes, it does create these moments of rupture. Yes, it can be generative. Yes, it can be the opposite of that. But it's never not there. It's never sort of not functioning in a very active way in people's lives. And I guess the last thing, and I really don't think I'm responding to all your points, but I should probably just not say too, I've already said so much, but just thinking about, part of why I'm interested is also that in both the histories of both these countries in the 60s, there's always this dynamic between kind of two narratives. One is a sort of narrative of repression that Senghor and Yulu really put out there. which kind of said like, this was the work of these clandestine Marxist organizations. Like Yulu's memoir is called J'accuse la Chine, like I accuse China. Like he was still convinced 20 years later in Spain that like China had done it. But on the other hand, the activists of that era have always responded by saying, no, like it wasn't the PAI, it wasn't, us. These were big spontaneous movements, right? That developed naturally out of people's grievances against these regimes. And I think in my work, what I'm trying to do is to kind of, sort of, I'm going against kind of both of those narratives in both places, right? Which is to say that actually the dynamics of these clandestine organizations are very important in kind of triggering repression, which then kind of triggers these mass uprisings. But you have neither clearly spontaneity, just sort of existing independently, nor do you have this kind of conspiratorial, and he treats it as conspiratorial claims either.
Thanks, Matt. I'd like to maybe follow up on a couple of things that you said, and I'm also welcoming people to ask questions in the Q&A if they'd like to join in the discussion. But yeah, I mean, well, maybe the first one, the first one is yeah, kind of, so thinking about again about the framework, that kind of space, kind of, yeah, bringing Senegal and Congo-Brazzaville together. And I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, yes, and there's the French context. And so I guess maybe a question here is about France, and if you want to speak a little bit to, I guess, France as maybe like a silent third, kind of agent or actor here in this story, or not, or if like is France maybe not that central anymore. I mean, there's kind of also thinking about Burley Hendrickson's decolonizing 1968, and the idea of looking at events in this case is Senegal and Tunisia as kind of sort of and France as all post-colonial kind of in nature as first. And I was wondering, like, where do you situate yourself maybe in relation to this kind of question, and to also like a second point I'd be also curious to hear you about is kind of how the framework that you presented in the talk today would apply to or would not apply to Brazzaville after 1963. So because that's interesting here also, like yes, it's Yulu, and then but it's Yulu in 63 mostly in the talk, and then Senghor not only but mostly in 68. And so, but there is, as you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there is also forms of repression happening, under Mayan Gwabi in 68 or 71 in Congo, Brazzaville. So, kind of, what is like, are there like also lines of continuities here, thinking about state violence and repression, and also activism, I guess, before, after 63 in Congo, Brazzaville,
Yeah, great questions. I appreciate that, because I do think, I didn't really get into kind of the specifics around France's role, but it's pretty prominent. I mean, and Burley's Hendrickson's book is great on sort of thinking about these kind of post-colonial spaces and how intimately they're tied to empire. And it's very tangible in Senegal and Congo, right? Because like most of the former French colonies and in Africa south of the Sahara, you still have the French military present there, and you have these military alliances that effectively allow for the government to call in the French military in situations where it's threatened. And so both Yulu in 63 and then Senghor in 68 make those phone calls they make those phone calls to Paris. In 63 with Yulu, Yulu had been allied to a bunch of sort of Vichyites. And so de Gaulle was a little, less, shall we say, kind of willing to back him up. He was also just kind of a less sort of stable, kind of known figure in sort of de Gaullist circles. And so they let him go. They're basically like, no, we're not going to shoot people down the street to keep you in power. In 68 in Senegal, though, Senghor had been such a kind of long-standing player in not just Senegalese politics, but actually in French politics during the 1950s. That his connection was very sturdy, I guess you could say, and particularly kind of with the Gaullist bloc. And so when he makes that phone call in 68, well, it was a telegram initially, but telegram, they respond very promptly. With all the in the files of Jacques Faucard, you still have all the telegrams going back and forth. But they respond very quickly that they move in the French troops to kind of, and that frees up the Senegalese troops to then go after the people kind of in the streets downtown. And that's what kind of saves Senghor at the end of the day. So France is very much like, even if it's in the background, it's very much playing this almost kind of determinant role in how these two kind of narratives, the direction these two narratives go. But it's similar for the kind of opponents, right? For the opponents of Senghor and Youlou, right? Their connection to France is also part of how they kind of conceptualize their opposition, right? Because their focus is on this idea of real independence or true independence, or indépendance inachevée, like an unachieved independence that they feel like, they see every day. So they see it when they go to classes. All of the deans at the University of Dakar were French, I think French, certainly European, but so is the rector, who was kind of like the president. The University of Dakar was officially, until 68, like the 18th French university, and it gave out French diplomas. So there was this way in which, this new kind of generation really felt like, they were sort of living in this world still of a kind of French colonial experience. In some ways, the further up they got kind of socially, in particularly in terms of education, the more they found themselves still kind of deeply implicated in that world. And that's a big part of what they're sort of pushing against. And so France really is this very important kind of like pivot around which a lot of these debates play out. And in terms of post-1963 repression in Brazzaville, things just get really interesting. Things just get really messy, I guess. I felt like there's no way I could get into it in this talk, right? But on the one hand, you have all these people who have been who are on the receiving end of repression under Youlou, who now suddenly are in positions of authority, and now they feel very threatened by Youlou. Initially, sort of flees the country. He crosses the river, basically, gets to Leopoldville on the other Congo, and from there he works with Tshombe and then with Mobutu to launch attempted coups against this new revolutionary government in Brazzaville. So now you've got the people who've been on the receiving end of repression. They're starting to turn the repressive apparatus on the former supporters of Youlou in an effort to, in their mind, sort of save the revolution. But you can quickly see how this begins to kind of become personalized, and there's ways in which it begins to sort of spin a little bit out of control. And so you have, these killings that happen in the mid 60s that nobody still today entirely kind of wants to say who exactly was responsible for them. And you have this kind of way in which repression never sort of leaves the picture in any kind of way, but the political parameters really changed a lot. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. I'd like to ask if there is a question from the audience. Otherwise, I may just ask a last question myself.
I see
Okay.
Elisa, she's raised her hand. I think I should just allow her to talk.
Okay. Because I don't see.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Lisa.
Yes. Oh, hello. So I can't see you, so I'm just talking to my screen. But Matt, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So my question for you, Matt, and thank you for the wonderful talk. Very, I think both conceptually and archivally rich. Your images are just phenomenal. And my question is, I think the analysis seems to have lingered very much on the political. And I wondered more about the economic and material context of the as the 60s go on, I suppose, and how that might affect when repression is generative and when repression is repression that works.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. And it's something I've been trying to think about as well. I mean, and particularly, you know, because part of my argument is that, you know, you have to have these material grievances, or like the repression becomes generative for these movements because there's a wider set of the population that is kind of sitting on these material grievances, particularly in the cities over the course of the 1960s. And those get inflamed by these instances of repression. But they have at their root a lot of the kind of economic problems of decolonization at the end of the day. So you have these big waves of urbanization, particularly in Brazzaville, right? Congo-Brazzaville becomes, I believe, like the most urbanized country in Africa south of the Sahara by the kind of early to mid 60s. It's not very big, but it's mostly in the cities. But there's simply no way that these new governments, even if they wanted to, really probably could have kind of kept up with the sudden demand around education, just like seats in schools, teachers, but certainly then of jobs, right? So most of these companies, most of the sort of major sources of employment, besides the kind of the state and the civil service, are still occupied by foreigners, particularly kind of positions for educated folks, like kind of, you know, formally Western trained educated folks. And so a big part of what the students in Senegal are protesting is also like they graduate and there's no jobs, right? They feel locked out. They see foreigners in these kind of engineering jobs, in these teaching jobs, in these managerial jobs. And of course, the Senegalese state or the Congolese state is all too happy to like let France, you know, send a cooperant rather than have to pay more teachers out of pocket. And so there's both these kind of economic concerns on the part of, you know, in theory, these relatively privileged students and university graduates who are graduating, but in larger and larger numbers, but there isn't a kind of market out there for them to really find the kind of work that they're expecting and maintain the kind of lifestyle that they're expecting. And then for, you know, the kind of vast majority of people in these cities, you just have increasing sort of costs of housing, and with that also sort of problems of unemployment and, you know, just really a sort of frustration that nothing is really being done to kind of ameliorate a lot of the city environment. When Senghor tries to kind of renova, like there's a renovation, like I don't know exactly how you would translate that, but of the Medina, which is kind of the sort of heart of the kind of African population neighborhood in downtown Dakar. There's a lot of resistance from the people who live there because they're all going to supposedly be like relocated way up on the way up on the, you know, away from downtown. But there's no sort of guarantee of what kind of housing they're going to exactly get. And so they're frustrated that the only kind of reforms that seem to be coming their way are, instead of, you know, sort of better access to running water, electricity, it's just moving them out, right? And so there's a lot of kind of, I think, this intersection of sort of the economic, political, and social is very tangible for most people. Thank you, Elisa.
Thanks, Matt. I think it's quite useful to think about the maturity also of the two cities. I think it's good. It's an interesting maybe set of comments to end the session today, because I think we're kind of like going towards the end of our time. So I want to thank you very much. Was nice to see you and then hear more from your work. Thanks to everyone who attended, and I'm really looking forward to reading more and to kind of the next step in the project. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thanks to